and fellow colleagues. Welcome to today's CLC lecture series on adaptation, cities and the challenge of climate change. My name is Guan Ho and I'm from the Center for Liveable Cities. The Center for Liveable Cities was jointly established by the Ministry of National Development and the Ministry of Environment and Water Resources, with the aim to distill, create and share knowledge on livable and sustainable cities. The CLC lecture series is one of the platforms through which urban thought leaders and international experts share best practices and exchange ideas and experiences. In today's session, we are very honored to have with us Professor Klinenberg, Professor of Sociology and Director for Institute for Public Knowledge at the New York University. Professor Klinenberg is also the Research Director for Rebuild by Design, a federal project that provided nearly $1 billion for innovative solutions to climate vulnerabilities in the New York metropolitan region. Today, Professor Klinenberg will share with us how governments around the world have been investing in elaborate plans to protect their cities from climate change. He will explore how cities will have to adapt or are adapting to inevitable consequences of global warming, rising sea levels, and more frequent dangerous weather events. We will first begin with a presentation by Professor Klinenberg, followed by a question and answer session. The discussion will be moderated by Mr. Chiu Wen-Tong, who is Acting Group Director of Research and Development from the Urban Redevelopment Authority of Singapore. Without further ado, we would now like to invite Professor Klinenberg on stage. Professor, please.
Thank you for that warm introduction. Can you hear me okay? Yes. Okay, thank you. First, let me begin by thanking the Center for Liveable Cities for hosting this event. That's better now. And also for hosting me this week. It's been wonderful to be here. I'm learning so much about Singapore. I'm very excited about the beginning of this relationship. So I hope this is the first of many interactions. You know, this is a big week to be giving a lecture about cities and climate change. And I'm a little bit worried that the population of people in Singapore who are working on this issue all the time are all in Paris right now. But hopefully it's a big group effort and you're all involved in it as well. So you probably know this chart. And if you don't know this chart, you should get familiar with it because it's a chart that tells us a lot about what we have done as a civilization, as a species, over the last century. And the later part of the chart that would continue after the end of the right on your right would tell the story of our future. It's a chart that shows the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere in terms of parts per millions. And you can see that incredible steep incline. And so the debate in Paris is about the question of how we will reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, right? Because there's a strong relationship between CO2 in parts per million in the atmosphere and global temperature, which is related to sea level rise and all kinds of additional problems. And I would say, let me just begin by saying that I think the most urgent challenge related to climate change is this challenge of mitigation. Can we come up with some alternative source of energy that's going to allow us to bring that incline down, right, and prevent global temperatures from rising? I think there's nothing more urgent than that project. But that's not what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about another issue, which is really the second thing in the background of the climate change conversation, about adaptation. And you know, for many years, people who were concerned about climate change said, you shouldn't talk about adaptation because we don't want to give the impression that we can adapt to the changes in the weather and to sea level rise and to ocean acidification. We don't want to think that we can't adapt because that will take away the energy that we need to invest in the bigger project of reducing our carbon footprint. And I am very sympathetic to that idea, but here's the problem now. We have reached a point where we already have so much carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that even if this pointer turned into a magic button, and at this very moment I could press a button on this and stop all global greenhouse gas emissions today, right now, we would still face many decades and probably centuries of climate change because of what we've already done to the climate. And what that means is we'll see higher sea level rise, we'll see more frequent, more intense and longer lasting heat waves, we will see more rain events, hurricanes, and so we have no choice but to adapt. It's no longer an option. We have to have this conversation, even if it's a secondary one. Now there's a problem with adaptation, and that is that adaptation is expensive, right? If we think of adaptation as a climate security project, protecting ourselves from the most violent aspects of climate change, adaptation is an expensive initiative. And what that means is that there's a risk that it will inevitably generate new inequalities and exacerbate old inequalities. People who are lucky enough to live in the nations or in the cities or in the neighborhoods that have resources will be better able to protect themselves than people who live in poor places. And it's a biting irony, because people who live in affluent places are also the people who are most likely to have been responsible for the greenhouse gas emissions that are making the world vulnerable. And so you begin to see why this negotiation in Paris is so complicated, right? So that's the underlying challenge for this general issue. And I want to call attention to it, and I ask you to keep it in your mind as we go through the rest of the lecture and conversation today, because it's a very big problem. Now, what I'm going to do first is try to explain that even in some of the most affluent places in the world, I want to show you today that even in the most affluent cities you can find, securing yourself from the ravages of climate change is no easy task. Adaptation is very difficult, even if you have resources. And what I want to call attention to today are two sets of things. One has to do with infrastructure, the hard infrastructure. And actually, you know a lot about how to do good hard infrastructure here in Singapore. I have to say, as a visitor, it's just extremely impressive to see what you've done here. But I'm also going to talk a lot about something that is unusual for these conversations, and that is what I've come to think of as the social infrastructure that actually can determine life and death in these events. So I'm going to begin by taking you to this city here. This is, maybe some of you recognize the city. This is the city I grew up in. It's Chicago. I'm going to tell you about research I've done in Chicago. And then I'm going to tell you about New York. And then I'm going to tour you through a very innovative project called Rebuild by Design that President Obama sponsored with the White House these past few years that I've been the research director for, to think a little bit about what climate change adaptation could look like even if you have a lot of resources, okay? So that's our plan. You ready to go to Chicago? It's cold right now, but it's hot here. So this is Chicago in July 1995. It gets hot in the summer. And you know about heat here, I can tell. But this was extremely hot. The temperature in July of 1995 reached, I'm going to do Fahrenheit. Is that okay? Will that translate? I don't know Celsius very well. Well, 106 degrees, which is pretty hot. But the thing about Chicago that week is that it was very humid. And so what the temperature felt like for typical people was 126 degrees. And even in Singapore, that sounds hot, right? Now, but what's interesting about Chicago, and it's interesting about many cities, is we have something called the urban heat island phenomenon, and maybe you know about it. Cities are heat islands. Singapore is a city island that's also a heat island, so it's an heat island squared. But the thing about a heat island is the urban development, the concrete, the steel buildings, they attract the heat from the sun. And then all of the pollution that we generate from industrial facilities, from cars, from our intensive use of resources traps the heat. And that matters because it means that you don't get the evening cooling that you get in other environments, rural environments. You have high-low temperatures. And so not only was it very hot during the day in Chicago, it was also extremely hot at night, which meant that people who lived there got trapped. Now I'm going to show you some very blurry pictures, but the pictures will get better later. I just had to take these from old television sets. This is what television looked like in 1995. So what happens in major cities today when it gets extremely hot is that we set our records for energy consumption. Because we live in a world now where we all take air conditioning for granted, right? That we have a very simple solution for extreme heat, which is we press a button and it gets cool. I don't know too much about the electrical infrastructure in Singapore, except for I'm told it's quite reliable. In American cities, it is not so reliable anymore. American cities used to be quite distinguished because there were places where you knew you would get electricity no matter what, but that is not the case. American cities, time after time, break their records for energy consumption when it gets hot, and what happens is the system falls apart. And what you're seeing here is an image of people in Chicago spraying down the generators at the substation to try to keep them from blowing. And guess what didn't work? That does not work. So Chicago lost power. And many parts of Chicago lost power for more than 2 days. About 250,000 households, so maybe 700,000 people, have no power for more than 2 days, and it feels like 126 degrees at the peak. And you know, when the power goes out, it's not just that there's no air conditioning. Also, if you live in a high-rise building and you're in a big city, the elevators don't go up and down, so if you're older, you're really trapped. If you're frail, you're trapped. If you're disabled, you're trapped. And maybe you know this also, if you live in a high-rise building, the way you get water is that it's pumped up electrically. So if there's no electricity, you also don't have water, okay? So now think about this. It's 126 degrees, feels like 126. It doesn't get cool at night. You have no electrical use. You have no elevators, no water. Now what happens is that people in the United States, when it gets very hot, especially in urban areas, especially in poor neighborhoods and cities, respond by opening up fire hydrants to try to get water. And in fact, you know, this is a very difficult thing about heat waves. If you closed your eyes and you tried to picture a hurricane or a flood or an earthquake, you probably have an image in your mind of what that looks like, right? But if you close your eyes and think about a heat wave, nothing really comes to mind. Except for in the United States, what a heat wave looks like is this, you know, kids playing in fire hydrants outside to get water. That's a survival strategy that Americans use often, but in Chicago, so many thousands of fire hydrants were open at the same time that neighborhoods started to lose water pressure, right? So even on lower levels, people were losing their water. And the slide says water wars because the city had to send police officers to try to prevent kids and residents from opening up the hydrants, and they started to fight each other over this basic resource. Cooling didn't work, electricity didn't work, people's bodies also did not work. The heat, the relentless heat will break down your body if you don't have a way to escape it. Very quickly, people in the city began to get sick. Many people were trapped in their apartments, trapped in cars on streets that were gridlocked. They were not cooling down. Children would go to camps on buses that didn't have air conditioning, were sitting in buses for too long, got dehydrated. Thousands and thousands of people in Chicago, in excess of the norm, had to go to emergency rooms to get treatment for heat-related illnesses. And here's the problem. Half of the hospitals in Chicago, half of the hospitals in this massive city were so full in the emergency room they could not take any more patients. And so they had to go on bypass status, which means they closed their doors and said, we cannot treat any more people here. We don't have space. But there was no system for coordinating which hospitals were open and which were closed. And so ambulance drivers started to drive all over the city looking for empty places. Some had to drive as long as 10 miles. And this backed up the capacity of the city to provide emergency care. Imagine half of the hospitals being closed and not knowing where to bring someone. Now, interestingly, culturally, in many parts of the world, we have failed to recognize the heat as something that's very dangerous. Heat is an inconvenience, right? And it's relatively easy to get ourselves out of the worst of it. You press the button most of the time, the air conditioner goes on. So if you imagine a hurricane or some other major storm is heading towards the city where you live, the television is on for days tracking the storm, right? We all start to pay attention as the storm moves close to us. The health ministers get prepared, the mayor gets prepared, the political leaders from the top down start to tell everyone what they need to do. But in Chicago, people didn't think much about the heat as a health issue. And in fact, the city leaders were on vacation, because when it gets very hot in most societies in the world, the people who have real power and money get out of town. They go to the beach. That's not a moral statement, by the way. That's a sociological observation. And it's true in many parts of the world. That's what you do when it gets hot. And so the city leaders, from the mayor to the person who ran the paramedics to the person in charge of the health department, left town. And the city of Chicago had a heat emergency plan that they had developed, but they forgot that they had it. And they didn't use it, despite the conditions I described. And this is what happened. In a heat wave that lasted about 2.5 to 3 days, 739 people died, and thousands more were hospitalized with emergency conditions. And heat-related illnesses, if you're a medical person, you know that they can have ripple effects that last the rest of your life. You have multi-system organ breakdown, multi-organ system breakdown. It can be really serious. And this is a high and unacceptable amount of human suffering from something as benign as the heat, right? And what was really disturbing to me, because I'm a sociologist, is not just that so many people died, but that hundreds of people in Chicago died alone. They were discovered alone in their apartments, sometimes hours, sometimes days, in some cases weeks after they died. They tended to be older people, they tended to be poor, but they weren't universally old and poor. What was very strange about this is that it suggested that there were social conditions that were responsible for what happened. And in fact, when I set out to do research for the book I wrote about this, called Heatwave, I called the book a social autopsy of the disaster, because the climate scientists who looked at the meteorological conditions were unable to explain why as many people in Chicago died as they did. The climate models predicted that far fewer people would die in conditions like this than actually died. And they said we need some social science to explain the variance. And in fact, it's my view that there's a real role for social scientists to play in these conversations to explain outcomes that you can't explain just through engineering failures, or you can't explain just through the weather. It's much more than a natural disaster when something like this happens. It's a social disaster as well. And we need to understand the sociological underpinnings of it. So why did so many hundreds of people die? Why did so many hundreds of people die alone? Well, you know, there's a great tradition in sociology of creating maps of cities to try to understand variations in how neighborhoods as places experience things. And it's especially a tradition that was born in Chicago, the place where I was born to and where this project happened. So why not make a map? That's how I started. And something incredible happens when you look at the map, which is, this is a map that shows the neighborhoods that have the highest heat death rates and also the neighborhoods that have concentrated poverty. And hopefully you can see that they align close to perfectly. And if you know anything more about Chicago, these are actually very racially segregated neighborhoods. The south side, which is coming down, and the west side going that way are the black or African American neighborhoods. And so I am not going to win a Nobel Prize for this map, unfortunately, because that is exactly what you would predict, right? It's no surprise that the poorest neighborhoods, the neighborhoods that are suffering the most all the time, will have the worst outcomes in a disaster like this. It's what we expect. So that was important to show, but it wasn't scientifically all that interesting. But I'll tell you something that scientifically was very interesting. I started to look at the neighborhoods in the city that had very high death rates, and also the to neighborhoods that had very low death rates. I wanted to understand the variation. And when I looked at the numbers, I saw that, yes, it's true, the African-American neighborhoods, the poor neighborhoods, had the worst outcomes. But if you look closely, you saw some surprising things. So, for instance, there were many neighborhoods that were very poor, that had a lot of violent crime, that were very segregated racially, that actually did incredibly well. Many very poor black neighborhoods, for instance, did better than the most affluent neighborhoods in Chicago, right? And some did catastrophically badly. And so you couldn't tell from the numbers alone why that was the case. And I decided to go out and really get to know a bunch of neighborhoods to understand, is there something we can see about the texture of places that helps us explain these different outcomes, right? And I want to show you now two neighborhoods that are next door to each other in Chicago. They're both on the south side. They're both 98% African American, very segregated. They're ghetto neighborhoods. They're both extremely poor. They both have unusually high violent crime rates. And they had totally different outcomes during the heat wave. This is one neighborhood, it's called Englewood. And this is another hit neighborhood called Auburn Gresham. They're across the street from one another. Demographically, they look very similar. This neighborhood looks like it's a green neighborhood at first, right? This guy, you see plants, you see big trees. But actually, the reason that you see green tree there, and the reason you see that grass on the ground, is because those are empty lots. This is a neighborhood that has been abandoned. It's not just poor. It's also seen a collapse of the social infrastructure that makes collective life in cities work well. You don't see stores in this neighborhood. You don't see big commercial grocery stores. You don't see movie theaters. You don't see shopping malls. The sidewalks are broken. The parks are fairly threatening, especially for older people there. It's not just poor, it's abandoned and depleted. And if you're an older person, and you're an older person who lives alone in particular, this is an ecology that is actually very threatening to you. And people who live in this neighborhood who are older and a little bit frail have a greater tendency to stay home, to shut themselves into their apartments, and that's what they did during the heat wave. And they were 10 times more likely to die that week than people who lived in this neighborhood, Auburn Gresham. Right? Where even though there's brick architecture and the buildings bake like ovens, their conditions on the street are much more likely to draw people into social life, to have contact with their neighbors. And let's face it, when the heat is the threat, saving someone's life is relatively simple. Recognizing that they're having a problem, exposing them to water, finding a way for them to get cool, even if it's bringing them into a car for air conditioning, or putting them in very cold water if it's early enough into a bath, is enough. And people in this neighborhood fared much better. But here's something else that's incredible about the difference between these two neighborhoods. That social infrastructure, not only does it save people's lives during heat waves, but if you live in this neighborhood, your life expectancy is 5 years longer than if you live in this neighborhood across the street. There's something about the nature of these places that's very important. And actually understanding what breaks down during disasters helps us understand conditions of neighborhood life every day that we could pay more attention to. Now I'm guessing many people in this room, maybe most people in this room, have never heard of the Chicago heat wave. I mean, after all those disasters that kill thousands and thousands of people, this is not one of the world history's great events. But for the United States, a very affluent society, this is a disaster that's quite large and significant. But what was striking about it is how little attention it got and how squandered the opportunity to learn from it was. This is an image of a scene in a suburb outside of Chicago after the heat wave where dozens of people who died and no one ever came to claim their bodies were buried together in what looks like kind of a mass grave. If you see an image like this, you don't think of Chicago, right? You think of a very different part of the world, but that is Chicago, and that is a haunting image as far as I'm concerned. But the reason you don't know about this event has a lot to do with Chicago too, because another very haunting image is this before you now. It's the cover of Chicago's own major report about what went wrong. You know, disasters happen in the world today. We talk a lot about resilience these days, and one reason is because we kind of take for granted that we will experience shocks to the system. The talk of resilience is as loud as it is these days because people are concerned about the disasters that we will witness as the climate changes. Disasters are cases where things go catastrophically wrong, but the one silver lining of disasters is if we treat them well, we can learn from them so that things go better the next time, right? So that we can protect ourselves better, so that we can help others protect themselves better. But Chicago refused to do that because we also have a tendency to treat disasters as public relations crises more than public health problems. It's the tendency of many governments to try to make sure that no one really pays attention because they don't want to be blamed for the things that went wrong. And so when Chicago published its big report about the heat wave, this was the cover. And you might notice two strange things about this cover. One is that that phrase heat wave does not appear anywhere. But the thing that's really scary and strange for me is that there's a snowflake on the cover, which we say is Orwellian. It was designed to make sure that no one ever knew about it, that no one learned from it. And that's why when in 2003, a heat wave hit Europe, and somewhere between 35,000 and 70,000 people died. Every public official in Europe who was interviewed about it said, how could we have known that the heat could be so deadly? Nothing like this has ever happened before. If we don't stop and learn from the disasters we experience, it's much easier for the next city and the next leader to say, how could we have known? We should have known. And here's what's so strange about this story of 35,000 to 70,000 dead with 14,000 in France. Maybe you heard about the French experience in 2003. That's a very big number, right, 14,000. But actually, the death rate in France from 2003 was the same as the death rate in Chicago in 1995 because of the population. And the difference is that the heat wave in France lasted 3 weeks, but the heat wave in Chicago lasted 3 days. So ask yourself, what would happen to Chicago or to New York or to a city like that if the heat that they got in Europe had hit the United States? Maybe you don't have to worry about heat waves here. But one of the things about climate change we're learning is that it brings weird weather. It brings conditions that we never thought we'd have to prepare for. It brings black swans. So I left Chicago, and I moved to New York. And this is a storm that hit New York, and actually 20 states in the United States in 2012. We call it Sandy. You've probably heard of Sandy, right? That's what Sandy looks like from above. It's about 1,000 miles across. I mean, truly a massive storm. And Sandy actually generated the energy of 2 different storm systems that came together. We called it a Frankenstorm. But it wasn't funny. You can't picture a heat wave, but you can picture Sandy because there's an iconography. And this is the great image of that disaster. That's Manhattan. Maybe the power center of the world, right? And what's so striking about this image for those of us who live in New York is that this downtown area is about as wealthy as it could get. And I think for many of us who live in cities, we think well, because we live in the center of power and influence, because the financial capital of the world is here, because political power is concentrated here. We're going to be well taken care of and protected. No one would ever let this kind of thing happen where we live. If there's a power outage, it's going to happen here, it's going to happen over here, it's going to happen there, but it's not going to happen here. But that's what happened. And that area, the center of the world, was out of power for 5 days. And the economic impact of Sandy was $60 billion. So what happened? Well, first of all, in the region, as in many regions in the world, the way that the electrical grid works and the way that electricity moves throughout the region is on a technology that we call the pole. And we hang electrical wires on poles, and the electrical wires sit underneath big trees with large branches. And every time there's a big windstorm, the branches fall on the trees, branches fall on the poles, the electrical wires go down, and everyone loses power. And actually, the authority that handles power in this region, which is Long Island in New York, that has about 1 million customers, had a meeting, an emergency meeting, a few days before Sandy arrived, as they saw it coming, and they talked about many things, but it turns out the emergency had to do with another management issue and not the weather. And they spent 37 seconds talking about what to do for Sandy. 37 seconds. They have minutes. And so they didn't, for instance, even prune back the trees to make sure that there was less of a risk that the system would go down, but it did. People who lived here lost power for several weeks. New York is not alone, by the way, in having this kind of system. You know, we have not invested in securing electrical systems so that they're buried underground, or if they're above ground, that they're really in places where they're not going to come down. And so time after time in storms, people around the world lose power. This is the subway system in New York City. It's not an aquarium, it's the subway. And I just met a man who's responsible for helping to design the Singapore system. And you did a very intelligent thing here, which is that you have to go up to get down into the MRT, right? You don't have to in New York. And so that's what happened. Those subway lines filled up like bathtubs. And if you know New York, and what happened, what's incredible here is that the flooding was downtown. This is several miles north of where the flooding happened. Uphill, but it doesn't matter when you're underwater or underground. And so the flooding in the system was incredible. But actually what's so interesting about the New York system, which is not built to withstand the weather of the future, it was built for 19th century weather. It was built in the 19th and 20th century, for 19th century weather, is that engineers came in knowing that it would flood, and they ripped electrical wiring out from the sides, and they evacuated the cars to higher ground, and then they were ready to pump out the water, and because of that, the system was only down for 5 days. There's still billions of dollars of financial damage, but they did preparatory work because they were concerned about this weather and thought very hard about how do you govern an infrastructure that's vulnerable to reduce vulnerability. So while this doesn't look good, within 5 days the system was running again. This is across the river in New Jersey. And in New Jersey, the political leadership has been very reluctant to think seriously about the threats from climate change. And you don't need to be very worried about climate change to prepare for disasters, but in reality there tends to be a connection between those things. And so while New York City evacuated the subway cars to higher ground and cleared out wiring, in New Jersey they took $110 million of train cars and they put them to store in the floodplain. And we can laugh about it from Singapore, but if you lived in New Jersey and you paid the bill, or you couldn't get to work for several months because they had to buy new cars, let me tell you, it was not so fun. There was not a lot of laughter in New Jersey. The communication grid also failed during the disaster. And this is an interesting case, something that maybe the Singaporeans to think about as well. When we had copper wires underground that were connecting our phone system, they were relatively resilient. Now, increasingly, we have cut the cord on our old landline phones, and we all carry our mobile phones with us wherever we go, right? But mobile phone systems are far less resilient for the most part, right? They depend on electricity, whereas the old copper wires didn't. They're connected by towers, which can blow over very easily. In the US, I don't know about Singapore, but in the US, the federal government considers mobile phones to be entertainment devices, not lifelines. And so the regulation is actually very loose. The standards for maintaining service are much looser than they used to be for the telephone system, and they do not need to have the same level of duplicability in the system so that you have a backup. And the communication systems are incredibly fragile. And if you've ever been in a disastrous situation, something like Sandy and things look really bad, you'll know that when something is very scary and dangerous, when a hurricane or a monsoon hits and there's terrible flooding, and you're nervous about yourself and your mother and your friend, that's when you need to have communication the most. So all the things that were difficult to experience that week, having no communication, I think, was one of the most profound problems. And I know that New York is not alone in trying to solve that situation. This is a scene at the hospital that NYU, my university, owns and runs. And what's interesting about New York City is that there's a corridor of hospitals that just happens to be placed in the prime flood area on the east side of the city, a whole line of hospitals. And they flooded. And interestingly, the requirements for zoning ask that hospitals put things like the vital systems for power, backup fuel for generators in the basement for a good reason, because it protects the chemicals and other things from circulating into the air. So actually the idea was, if things are buried in the basement, right, the electrical lines, the fuel, backup, the computer systems, if they're in the basement, then they'll be safer. Because remember, we didn't think about flooding. We lived in a different world. But now, things have changed. And it can flood here. And so, the hospitals lost their power, the hospitals lost their backup power, the elevators didn't work. They had to be evacuated in the middle of a hurricane. This is an image of hospital staff carrying infants from the NICU, the neonatal intensive care unit. These are premature babies that had to be carried by hand down 9 floors with air being pumped into their lungs with paper bags, transported into ambulances on the street during a hurricane. Not a single one died. But if we don't design our cities and our systems to deal with the threats that we now face, we require heroic action to keep ourselves alive. But if we start to think about these challenges in advance and invest resources in adaptation, maybe we don't need heroes to make sure that the people we care about most get through the night. What can we start to do to protect the cities we live in, where we have so many people now living in harm's way? How do we think about climate security as a collective project? This is London, and there are some places on Earth that could not exist if we didn't build large sea gates that would keep the water out. There is no New Orleans without the levee. There's no Rotterdam or Amsterdam. There's no Netherlands without big walls. Venice is about to be saved by a system they call Moses. But they're big and expensive and difficult, and they don't always work, and you can't protect every coastal city on Earth. We can't wall in our species, can we? After Sandy, people in New York proposed that they build this bridge. This bridge is here, this is the Verrazano Bridge, but build this gate to protect Manhattan. That doesn't exist if you haven't been to New York recently. That's not really there, that's a drawing. But you know there's a problem. If you build gates like this, first of all, they're very, very expensive. But the other thing is that when the stormwaters hit and the sediment hits hard, they don't just disappear when they hit the gate, do they? They go here, and they go there, and they go for many, many miles. So if you protect this, you're also telling these people for a long way that they can forget about it. So that doesn't go over very well, does it? And we're quite litigious in the United States. We like to sue each other. And even if we tried to build that gate, it would probably take many years of legal fighting. And there's another problem too, which is when you build a gate like this, the idea is that you keep the gate open most of the time, right? Because there's a very fragile ecosystem. This is the Hudson River going up there. And for many, many miles, the ecology depends on the flow of water with the ocean. So you keep the gates open, but as sea level rises in coming decades, depending on where you build this, you would have to keep these closed too much of the time. And if you have to keep this closed too much of the time, then you're changing the ecosystem behind it. So gates have not been the best solution. Look familiar? Now, I quite like this one, however. And one reason I do is because if we say, look, we have no choice but to protect ourselves from the water that's coming, one of the things that we have to do is make sure that our investments in climate security don't only protect us from the terrible weather we fear. We have to make sure that the designs and the projects that we build to protect ourselves from weather also make life better for everyone every day. I think of this as a multi-purpose benefit that we need to have, right? If we are going to invest in climate security, let it be about improving the quality of our lives, our communities, our cities all the time, and not only making sure that a terrible thing that may happen doesn't happen. And what's great about this is not this, although that is really great when there's bad weather. What's great about this is all of this, right? The whole world that creates for residents and for tourists and for new visitors who want to come to see what the Marina Barrage looks like and to enjoy the gardens by the bay and all the amenities associated with. And then there's this, the water recreation, right? I've learned about ABC. This makes life better every day. If what we're going for here is improving health, these are the kinds of systems that we need to build. And I understand that were it not for certain people who happened to be in the room when these projects came together, that might have just been a wall. That could easily have just been a wall, right? So how do we make sure that every time we do climate security, that is there too? This is a park in Rotterdam, which shares many of the issues you deal with here in Singapore. Right? They too have flood risks, and they too need to find new sources of water and have tried to expand the catchment area. So this is a park, a skate park and a playground, but the walls go up, and this becomes one of many parks that can be converted into a water storage facility and diverts water underground where it can be recycled and reused. And cities around the world have to do this. I've learned a lot about how much Singapore needs to do this while I'm here. It's a common project. You can't protect every place, though. This is an area in New York City. There's Manhattan. This used to be what we call these barrier islands. And the reason we call them barrier islands is because they were ecologically meant to be barriers that protected all of this area in here where people lived, except for now, they look like that. So we've settled the barriers because it's the ocean. Right? One of the things that we have done collectively in cities around the world and all kinds of cultures over the last 40 years is we have discovered that waterways, whether the ocean or rivers that we used to dump dirty things into, could actually be beautiful. So we cleaned up the rivers, right? We cleaned up the waters, ABC. We developed land there. We shop there. We play there. We treasure them. But we've also gotten rid of our barriers, haven't we? So that's what it looks like on a nice day in the Rockaways. And that's what it looked like after Sandy hit. We're not going to stop the water from there. And we're not going to stop the water coming there. So how do we make sure we're okay if we live in a place like that? You can raise your homes, and there is many people now, or many societies or states are starting to invest in elevating homes, but it's very expensive. At the family basis, it's very expensive to do that. And if you have large buildings, it's technically impossible to do it. You're more or less defenseless. What was fascinating to me about spending time in places like the Rockaways, and this is another area called Red Hook, that's similarly vulnerable on the riverside, is that residents there were physically vulnerable to the storm surge from Sandy, but they were lucky to be in places where there were very strong community organizations that could be converted into emergency relief operations. These weren't places that were designed to provide relief to people during disasters. This place here was a surf club. It had just started a year before Sandy hit. But the people had gotten to know their neighbors very well. They had a nice open space, a facility that could be converted for different uses. And this is an organization that helps children who live in the housing projects, mostly African American and very poor, to stay in school and to get to college or to find jobs. But the thing that these two organizations had in common is that they had invested a lot of time and energy and resources into establishing relationships with people who live in the neighborhood. And so the people who worked in those places knew who was around and who was at risk and who lived alone and who needed help. And they could put out information to say, if you need something, come. If you have something to give, come. And thousands of people came. Because no matter how we design things, no matter how brilliant our engineers, at some point, things will break down. And when things break down, as they did in Chicago, as they did in New York, as they have in so many cities, that's when all of these social things really start to matter. So let me approach the end of this by asking you to join me in thinking about how we can start to learn from what we've experienced and begin to remake cities for the world we're entering. This is also Chicago. This is the City Hall in Chicago, which has a very famous green roof. And one of the city's big responses to the heat wave was to make a green roof. And green roofs are important technologies. They reduce the heat island. They can absorb water. They can cool down the city. But as impressive as this is, it's not going to save a lot of lives. It's not going to help people who live in neighborhoods where the people are most vulnerable, right? It's a symbol of something, but it's not much more than that. But there are neighborhoods in Chicago that are depleted and that have that infrastructure you saw in Englewood before that could really use gardens. There are places where it's hard to get fresh food, actually. But there are places that lack facilities that bring people of different generations together in the neighborhood so that younger people and older people can do things together and get to know each other, right? So that younger people and older people can experience a way of being in the city that connects them to things that are green. Now, this can be very superficial and meaningless, right? Just having a green space. It's not going to solve anything. But one of the challenges of climate change is that we all have to start to reconnect to the ecological environment we have in a more profound way. We have to remember our relationship to ecological systems that modern life encouraged us to forget. There's a silly way to do it and there's a meaningful way to do it. But if we can find ways, even just supporting community gardens, it's not not going to solve a problem, but it could do something for the social resilience of cities that's worth paying attention to. And it's striking, how much less expensive it is to go to every neighborhood that needs something in Chicago and do this than it is to do this just once. This is New York. And I presume some people in this room have moved at some point in their life to a different city. And when you move to a city, you have an image of what that city is going to look like before you move there. And it's usually a very exciting image. Maybe you even do this when you're going to choose where you're going to go on vacation. You close your eyes and you think about what that place is going to look like. And when I moved to New York City, I had an image in my mind of New York City that was like glittering lights and beautiful skyscrapers and sidewalks full of beautiful people. It wasn't this. But since Sandy, I have not been able to get this image of New York City out of my mind. And climate change is starting to do that, right? It's making us reimagine the places we live and know. I can't get the images out of my mind. I mean, they are there. And so, I was so fortunate when after the event I started writing about what happened there, and I got this call from the federal government asking me if I would lead the research for this Rebuild by Design competition, which was an international competition that invited teams of architects and engineers and social scientists from around the world to propose innovative ideas, not just to rebuild what had been destroyed by Sandy, but to rebuild better in anticipation of the weather to come. And I want to take you a little bit through this process we did, because it was a very unusual design competition. It didn't say, send us your proposals and we'll pick the best one and we'll build it. We said, send us a concept piece, tell us a roster for your team, and we're going to pick 10 teams, and we're going to bring them to New York for a 9-month process. This competition said, look, we're going to bring you to New York for a 9-month process, and for the first 3 months, we're going to do research together. We're going to go out all over the region, and we're really going to look at these ecosystems, and we're going to look at people's ways of settling, and we're going to understand what the needs are, and also what the possibilities are, and also what the vulnerabilities are. And we're going to register that before we introduce the plan. So we did this for 3 months together, and we had leading scholars from all over the region who effectively volunteered their time to work with these teams. We then went into the neighborhoods and said, we're going to listen to you. We're going to have this intensive period of civic participation where we're going to talk about what kinds of projects you would like. What are the things that your neighborhood needs? What things don't you need? Right? And we did months of this. We did hundreds of these meetings. The guy here, his name is Henk Obink. He's now the Dutch ambassador for water, who was on loan to the United States government during this period to help. He was the director for this project. And then there was a long period of design where the design groups got together and consolidated this information and made proposals. And I want to just give you a quick tour of one of them before we wrap up and get into the conversation. This is actually one of the most affluent neighborhoods in New York City. It's called Tribeca. Maybe you know about it from the movies. And I just want this here to show you that it's not just the poorest places in the world that are going to suffer from these unexpected events, right? I mean, this is expensive real estate that you couldn't protect, and there was enormous damage. The city had to think about how do you prevent something like this from happening? And one of the proposals that won from the Rebuild by Design competition is called the Big U, from the architect Bjarke Ingels. And it's called the Big U because it is designed to protect Lower Manhattan, where there's really major investments in infrastructure, a lot of significance, a lot of people, a lot of wealth. How do you protect it without having a seawall? Right? If you protect it well, then this is what happens after Sandy. But if you don't protect it, you have this, right? So there are many billions of dollars of difference between these two states, and a lot of human lives spared. So they proposed an idea which involved taking the West Side Highway here, this is the Hudson River, And right now, this does not exist. This wall doesn't exist. Right? The idea of putting up a wall in a city is a pretty ugly idea, right? And we don't really want that for Manhattan. But what the Big U project tried to explore is what could happen if you exploded our idea of what a wall is and built something that would protect you from flooding, but that would also make the experience of being in this place better, more interesting every day. It's worth thinking about, right? That's the image you saw. That doesn't exist right now. But that's a fantasy of what Lower Manhattan might have looked like if this had been in place when Sandy hit. That's the west side of Lower Manhattan. That's a very affluent area. This is the east side, in a much less affluent area, where there's real social vulnerability, a very thick cluster of public housing, high levels of poverty, a lot of concern about gentrification, wealthier young professionals moving in and displacing people, and that's what it looked like during Sandy. And it's interesting, like, I live right around the New York University, between those two areas, and I have a lot of friends who drop off their children in the morning and they go jogging. And they always jog on the west side of the city, which we just saw, instead of the east side of the city. And I'm going to give you a very short video that's going to show you what it would look like for them if they ran on the east side of the city. That's the run. I know we're running late on time, so I made you run fast. But my point was that was a pretty ugly run, wasn't it? Nobody wants to do that run. So what the Big U proposed in this impervious and ugly surface is that they began to build a bridging berm. None of this exists right now. This is actually a flood control system. This is a wall. That's not what you think of when you think of a wall, but their proposal is to make this the wall. That's a pretty nice wall, isn't it? That's really a fantasy image, by the way, that you would swim in the East River, but the notion is that you could control the water someday. So, now that's a pretty amazing plan. And actually the federal government provided hundreds of millions of dollars to build not the west side, not to protect the affluent community, but the east side to protect people who have the need. And here's the thing, remember this point about climate change adaptation and inequality. There really is a risk that without a values-based social policy that prioritizes protecting the most vulnerable people, that adaptation will necessarily be there for people who have the most money and not there for people who don't. So here the federal government actually did the right thing and said, let's protect the people who really need it. And what I want to emphasize here is that at the first stages of the interactions between, this is the woman who heads the community organization here, and this is one of the members of the architecture team from the Big U, and this is Hank Oving, the director. When we first started this conversation, she said that when her community saw these images, they said, we don't want that. And the government said, well, why don't you want that? And they said, because if you make our neighborhood look that beautiful, the real estate developers are going to come in, and in 10 years, we're all going to be out of here. We don't trust you. And actually, it took an enormous amount of time to go back and draw up a plan that had enough amenities that people in the neighborhood wanted, that they signed up to do it and said yes. But still, no one could guarantee them that that nightmare that they have is not going to happen, right? No one can guarantee that. It's a risk that they have to take. But had it not been for this process of really doing outreach, not only would the plan seem less legitimate and feel all the more threatening, but it would be a much weaker plan. And that's just one site. There were 6 different sites in the region. That was the most contested one. There's 6 different sites in the region where the plan that the designers came up with was so much better, so much more meaningful and useful to residents than it would have been had they just proposed something without that process of consultation and participation, without the representation of people and communities. And that is something I think is worth discussing in Singapore. You know, what kinds of collective processes can you undertake to make sure that the designs that we build work for people who use them? One future of New York and of cities around the world is the future of walls that look like this. And there are many people who will tell you that that's the future that we need. That's the future I hope we get instead. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Klinenberg, for that insightful presentation. We would now like to invite Mr. Chew to join Professor Klinenberg on stage for the moderated question-answer session. Mr. Chew and Professor Klinenberg, please. I will now hand time over for the question-answer session.
Okay, thanks, Prof. Eric Klinenberg. I think that was a very inspiring talk. I think many of you have questions, but I will get this ball rolling. I thought you presented a very interesting case where about climate change, starting with climate change, whereby if we need to do mitigation, but as you said, this is not what the talk is about. This is about adaptation. I had a friend who told me last time, you have a few ways to adjust to climate change. You mitigate, or you adapt, or you suffer. So for those people who don't have the resources to do the adaptation, they will end up suffering. Yeah. So I think in the Singapore's context, we are fortunate that we have sufficient resources and also the will to plan ahead, which you talked about as well, whereby I think you shared with us that in order to adapt to some of these extreme weather events, it's best to do it design up front, or you will end up having to need heroic action. And I think Singapore, sometimes we are called a city of planners. So we like to plan very far ahead, and many parts of different parts of society we have all sorts of contingency plans. But having said that, I would like to ask you a question later about do we overplan, or how much insurance in terms of adaptation do we need? And I think you also made an interesting proposition that in order to help us do the adaptation in the design by the cities is to look at multipurpose benefits. And I think you left us with a very clear direction of your preference, which is building gardens or your bridging berms versus building a big sea walls, whereby the bridging berms, I think, help us reconnect with nature and with build communities with each other, rather than basically having a big wall which have a huge ecological impact as well as huge cost, and basically make us look like living in a fortress. So it's a very gated community that separates us from each other and also from the mother nature. Yeah. So maybe I will start the ball rolling with a few maybe questions before I open it up to the floor. First question, I suppose, is how much of this adaptation do you think is reasonable? I'll give you an example. In Singapore, the extreme weather event that we most see is flooding. And we thought we actually solved the problem of flooding when we built the big drains in the area that's one of the most expensive and most flood prone, which is Bukit Timah. So for more than 10 years, we didn't have any flooding after we built the big drains and drainage systems around Bukit Timah. But in 2011, we had flooding on Orchard Road, which is the main shopping belt. And according to our colleagues in the Meteorological Service, is because we had a 50-year rainfall, once in 50-year rainfall, and that was the first time we had flooding. And 2 weeks later, it happened again. So 2 50-year rainfall in 2 weeks. Yeah. I was in Copenhagen that year, and they had the same thing. They also had flooding, and they also said it was 2 50-year rainfall and it also flooded twice in 2 weeks. So quite ironic. But the question I suppose that we have is, in order to mitigate all these floodings, you have to build huge amount of drains and when you talk about drainage, I think you have some of those gardens that you showed in Rotterdam. But all this take up space. The question is, it's not just a matter of cost, but land in Singapore is very scarce. So is there a reasonable amount for some things that would only be used once, supposedly every 50 years, maybe now it's every 20 years? And if that's the case, then how do we do it? Or do we build more social resilience? I'll give an example. If the roads get flooded, maybe the traffic light just have to blink red, and then you will prevent more cars from going in. And a day later, the water is clear. In fact, probably a few hours later, the water could be cleared. Yeah. Then how much of it should we accept in terms of allowing the system to react, as you said, or rather to take very extreme, not extreme, but buy a high amount of insurance that we probably will only use in a very infrequent, as you mentioned, the black swans.
So I think that's an important question, and you hit the specific way in which it's important in Singapore, which is there's questions about not just money but also land use. You can't just build out. So a couple things I want to say. The first is that what I have really tried to advocate in the policy work that I do, and I think this is born of the social scientific work that I've done as well, is to come up with designs that, like the Marina Barrage, will serve multiple functions, right? So can you design a drainage system, in this case, that will help to relieve the threat of flooding, but at the same time will have additional benefits for daily life, right? That's what the park is nice for in Rotterdam. And if there's a variation of that here, that could work. I don't know what it is, but it's worth exploring. I think it's also important for us to recognize that what global warming has done is it's taken that 1 in 50 year storm risk, and it's threatening to turn it into a 1 in 25 year risk or a 1 in 10 year risk. And so what that means when we design structures is that we have to ask what the standard for protection we're going for is. That's actually simpler in some ways if we're going for rain than if what we're thinking about is sea level rise. Well, if we're thinking about sea level rise and we're building infrastructures or protection systems, then we have to ask, do we want this system to work for 50 years? Do we want the system to work for 100 years? Do we want it to work for 150 years? And what's the climate model that we're using to predict the rate of sea level rise? Some of the models, the more dynamic models that take into consideration the possibility of, melting glaciers and polar ice caps, have quite high thresholds. If you think about, the infrastructures in the world's, older cities, and even in American cities, which are relatively young, the major infrastructures were built to last for centuries. So when we make an investment in building a new system, let's say a new subway system or a new electrical system, we want to make sure that it lasts. It's not just that we want to get the most out of it, it's that once we build it in, it becomes infinitely more expensive to build something else, right? How would you rebuild the subway system in New York City right now? That would be an incredibly expensive proposition. So I think you need to consider those things too.
Okay, I'll ask one final question before I open up the floor. So in the meantime, please think about what questions you'd like to ask Prof. Eric. One question, you highlighted the point about the neighborhoods who respond strongly. They have strong community bonds, and they build these strong community bonds during times of non-crisis, and it comes out very strongly post-Sandy and all that when people need to get together. But in Singapore's context, actually, we are very government-centric. Everything is done by the government. So I've heard of cases where other cities where they got placemaking efforts. They started because the government doesn't collect the rubbish. So they get together to collect rubbish, and then subsequently they do very nice placemakings because they build community bonds for clear need. But in Singapore, if the government is so front and center, how do you overcome this and move to a more community grounds up kind of movement where it's also related to your later point about having more civic participation in designs and all that, where I would say our government here is a bit thin-skinned. Where every time we propose something, I think the public expects it to happen, and the plan is supposed to be perfect. So how do we overcome some of these mindsets in the Singapore context?
Well, first let me say that I think the investments that governments have made in neighborhoods, both in terms of housing, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of commercial establishments, the space for commercial establishments, have established foundations that make communities stronger already. So let's not think that the government work has not been important. I haven't seen the surveys that tell me how connected and cohesive different communities are in Singapore, so I don't know. But if you ask me, if we were in Chicago and you said, what could the government do to improve community conditions, I'd tell you, build neighborhoods like you have in Singapore. Because the quality of housing and the quality of infrastructure and the quality of the parks, the density of the commercial life, this would be the fantasy of the neighborhoods that are most endangered elsewhere. So I say that just because I don't want you to take for granted and forget the significance of government investment in local life. It's real, and it's complete, for a stranger here, an outsider, it's totally visible. That said, how do you make sure that the communities continue to work well? How do you deal with the vulnerable communities of guest workers who might not have the same kinds of conditions? I think those are really interesting and important questions. If some kind of catastrophic event hit Singapore and the residents of the really fine public housing facilities did very well, and the migrant workers who were here on guest permits living in dorms suffered terribly, that would be a real shame for Singapore. So I think thinking about those kinds of issues of vulnerability matter quite a lot. It's my contention here that the way that you do emergency preparedness is actually not by telling people to prepare for storms. It's by making sure that their local community life works well every day. And if you find the way to do that, whatever that is, odds are people are going to be able to protect each other when they really need it.
Thank you. I now open the floor to questions.
Good afternoon, Professor Eric and Mr. Chiu. My name is Lim Sun Heng, and I'm a retired engineer. I used to work for a shipyard, Keppel Shipyard. I just want to make a quick remark about Chicago. Since you spent such a lot of time talking about Chicago, there's one particular building in Chicago called the 900 North Michigan Avenue. You know that?
I do know that.
You do?
Yeah. It's at the corner of Chicago and Michigan Avenue and Oak Street.
That building was built in Singapore and shipped over there.
Thank you.
Remember that?
That's great to know.
And I was a project manager.
That's wonderful.
Back in the 80s.
That's fantastic. Do you come to visit it?
Yes. Is it still the Bloomingdale's?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, good.
It's a nice large mall, and there's apartments above it.
Good. Well, that's not the reason I stood up.
That's great. I hope you come back often.
Thank you.
I have bad news for you, which is Michael Jordan is no longer playing basketball. So you can't see him anymore. But we have other good things there.
Well, as I say, I'm a shipyard engineer and retired. And my deepest passion right now is floating cities. I've written a few articles for the local press. The last one was in the Straits Times, October 7, I think. It's called SG 100, Floating Cities. I've also delivered a paper in the University of Ho Chi Minh City, University of Technology, on mega floats for a sustainable future. And actually, I pass it on to the organizers to give you a copy.
Thank you. Thank you.
I don't know whether they've done it, but I have already emailed them a copy of that. But basically, what I want to comment is that the only long-term sustainable way to save this planet is, unless you can stop all the carbon emissions, is really to take at least a quarter of the population, quarter of the 7.3 billion people, and most of them are living on the coast, and try to develop cities that are floating, right? Not only that, once you are able to do that, there are a lot of opportunities for harnessing of ocean energies, wind, sun, tidal streams, lots of other possibilities.
I look forward to reading it. It sounds fascinating and challenging.
Well, it's already sent to the organizers.
Okay, thank you very much.
So please read it. I also wrote an article in the Today newspaper that was in January about Singapore's land crunch, and the solution to that is really building floating real estates.
I mean, there's a very interesting point here, which is that you know, the challenge for our species already of reducing our consumption of greenhouse gases or reducing our emission of greenhouse gases is formidable, because even with 7 billion people, we have all this economic development, and as poorer societies develop, they too will begin to want to be able to consume resources the way that affluent societies have. But we also will not just stop at 7 million, the population will likely grow. And we will have more people consuming. And so the stakes of the fight about how to plan for this world and how to get new energies are very high, right? Who is going to get to pollute? But you said something that I think is so crucial that I think very few societies have really started to grapple with, and that is that probably about 800 million people in the world today who live in coastal areas that are prone to flooding and that will be quite vulnerable as the sea level rises. Yeah. And one of the challenges for adaptation, maybe the solution is for floating cities, but regardless, there are enormous numbers of people on Earth who live in places that might not be habitable in the visible horizon before us. And we have talked about two different kinds of solutions for adaptation, or strategies for adaptation so far. One is the idea of keeping the water out, right? So could we armor the coastal areas with seawalls and try to keep the water from coming in? In some places, that's been necessary. Another strategy that we talked about and that you mentioned in one of your questions is, we think of it as accommodation. Let's let the water in, and let's figure out a way, you said, let the floodwaters come. And the challenge will be to try to reduce the impact of flooding, right? Let's let the waters come in, but we'll build, you have these void decks here, which are actually, I know they weren't designed for climate change, but they turn out to be great for flood management because you don't have first floors that are quite as vulnerable with the vital systems there, with residents there, right? So another idea is, can we think about strategies that would allow cities to let the water in, and we'll find a way to live with that water until it floods out. And there's a lot of exciting work happening in design communities around this. But the third strategy, which is a variation on your question, is maybe we need to move. Maybe we need to relocate. There might be places on Earth that we will no longer be able to live on. And so we're beginning to see that in the Maldives, right, or in the Marshall Islands. There's island communities where sea level rise really threatens the viability of the places and could start to spark a wave of climate refugees. There's a whole bunch of security questions that are emerging there, right? but we're also beginning to see it in very affluent places as well. So one of the responses to Sandy, for instance, was for a number of communities to ask the government to buy out their homes so that they could move to higher ground. And we've always thought about this migration as an effort of moving to higher ground. But sir, your very interesting suggestion, which frankly I just don't know enough about to evaluate, is that we consider other places where we might move as well. So I know there's other people who want to ask some questions here, but let me just say thank you for the interesting insight.
Can I just make one quick remark before I give Adele just one quick one? I mean, so much has been talked about global warming. One important point that has been forgotten in all this discussion is that the freak weather caused by global warming is causing a loss of what we call the topsoil all around the world. And I think the topsoil, the loss of the topsoil with every heavy flood, flash flood, is going to be a more serious matter than your 2-degree rise in temperature. Okay. Because you lose your food, because without the nutrients in the topsoil, your food security is gone. That's my observation.
Thank you. Thank you. It's very interesting. I know there are hands on the other side of the room. Someone has a microphone. There you are.
My name is Aileen Wong. Professor Klinenberg, I find your talk very interesting in the sense that you talk about the provisions, the necessary requirements for the physical infrastructure, as well as the requirements for the social infrastructure. And as a sociologist, you want to bridge, your research tries to bridge the two. I just want to latch on to your last comment in your presentation, where you said that governments must make sure that local communities work. Now, Singapore, I'm not sure whether you have heard about it yet or read about it. The government does put a lot of resources in trying to strengthen the local community, whether through our housing designs, our estates, or urban planning, okay? And our daily work on the ground. Now, in the context of America and the experience of American cities, can you tell us, please, what are the things that governments must do in order to make sure local communities work? And what are the things that they must not do in order that local communities can work? Thank you.
Well, thank you for your comment, but what gave you the idea that the answers are to be found in the United States? I did not come here to offer American cities and American city planning as a model for you. I'm sorry. I think instead we have some things to learn from you. We have a very mixed history on this because the American government is responsible for the segregation that you see here. The American government is responsible for much of the depletion in those neighborhoods. And, we did these very large urban renewal projects. Where the reason that, I showed the image of that island community, the Barrier Island community and the Rockaways with all those public housing residents. And those families are there because the government moved them forcibly out of the neighborhood they lived in, the Upper West Side of New York, which is now the Lincoln Center and prime real estate. They claimed all of that housing and opened it up for city amenities, concert halls, and they moved the residents to an island, which is now very dangerous. So I can't say that the models for this are to be found in the United States, and there's a cruelty about the American urban system now, in that the market is driving so much has driven so much of the action that it's largely been the case that there's some very wealthy areas that have managed to protect themselves, and some poor places that have been left to fend for themselves. But what I do want to return to these two neighborhoods that are next to each other and tell you a little bit about the characteristics of the places that were adjacent, where one had a lot of death and the other had very little death, and one has very high social cohesion and the other doesn't. So some of the things are very basic. The neighborhoods that were really dangerous were places that had lost a lot of the population. So they started to see population depletion, and there was nothing done to stem that. As the population left, the commercial infrastructure also thinned out so that residents could no longer walk to their grocery stores. They had to get in cars or buses. Maybe that's a principle to think about. If you live in a neighborhood where you have to get on a bus or get into an automobile to get your groceries or to find your exercise, you're less likely to have street life nearby that will facilitate social interaction. So those are very basic things. But we also know actually that there's a higher density of community organizations whose purpose is to try to bring residents together in the neighborhoods that have higher life expectancy in American cities. That community organizations do very powerful and important work. And some of them come from the civic sector. For the most part, they're not run by government. They could be religious organizations, they could be political organizations, but some do get government support. And I think that it's important to recognize the work that community organizations can do. A lot of this, I've had a lot of conversations. I've been here this is my third day here, so I haven't had that many conversations, but I've learned a lot about the interest that people in Singapore have about the very rapid aging of society here. And as the society ages, you will also have more people who are aging alone. They will outlive their spouse, and their children will live in other places. And Singapore is like many other places on Earth in that there's a risk that people who age alone will get socially isolated. And you need to think about the kind of special work that community organizations could do to connect people who are aging alone to other people around them. Some things are very simple, like making sure that younger old people who are healthy but no longer working have opportunities to volunteer and assist and befriend and connect with older old people who might not be as active. But some things might require more work. So I would say there are a lot of possibilities, but you're probably not going to find the best answers in American cities, and certainly not in Chicago. Sorry. Yes?
Hi, Chris Tobias from NEA, and being from Chicago, I would definitely agree with you on that. I lived through that heat wave, and it was a bit of a mess. I wanted to return to your earlier comments about the migrations away from coastlines worldwide, and I know you'd mentioned in at least one of the communities in New York that they basically said, buy us out, let's move somewhere else. But I can remember growing up in several different areas in suburban Chicago where communities were built on floodplains, and periodically, you'd see flood events happen and such. And also seeing in the news headlines various states being hit by hurricanes on a fairly regular basis. And at least from what I recall back then, the sort of MO of people was, we will rebuild, and was very politically, rah-rah, and got the communities very riled up. Their political leaders were supportive of this sort of thing. But the thing that I kept on noticing was that, they were rebuilding in the same places in the same ways that they were affected in before by, admittedly a bad storm. How much do you think that both in the United States and elsewhere in the world, this sort of mentality of we will rebuild and building in many of the same ways in areas is starting to shift, if at all? Because it strikes me as something that's in many respects very un-American, and also just part of the human condition of no, we want to conquer nature and we want to live in that place. We like the amenity of the water nearby.
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. And the first thing I want to say is, you did make an important point, which I think often gets lost in these conversations. And that is that the threat of sea level rise and these storms is not just a threat for coastal communities. It's also one for cities that are on rivers, and especially delta cities, right? And we take for granted what it means to have regular river flooding, and we should not. So thanks for making that clear. I think rebuild by design was explicitly organized to make sure that we did not just build back what just came down. Rebuild by design was an explicit admission by the federal government that we can no longer do that. It doesn't make sense. And the state of New York itself, not the federal US government, but just the state, offered $400 million to buy out the homes of residents in Staten Island who said, we don't feel safe living here anymore, right? Now, after New Orleans flooded in Katrina, some officials raised the idea that maybe we should abandon New Orleans, maybe we should not build back that city, which doesn't make sense from an engineering perspective. But that was a real problem because New Orleans isn't just a ordinary city. It's a city that's got a very special history, and it's a city that has the places that people wanted to let go of were historically African American and poor neighborhoods. So that political statement looked as if it was saying, we're going to force the very poor people who live in this very special city out of their homes. And that was seen as very cruel, and so it was dismissed. But I think that what Sandy has changed is it's created a sensibility in the highest levels of federal government, and I think in many other places as well, that there might be areas that we should not build back. And there's actually a very big fight in New York about this issue because the governor of New York said, I'd like to convert that land, that I want to give money to families who live in low-lying areas to move, and I want to convert that land, I want to give it back to Mother Nature. Let's turn it into wetlands and marshes and let it come back to what we might think of as natural infrastructure. But then something very interesting happened. The mayor at the time was Michael Bloomberg. He was very interested in development and density, and right, there's another idea in the world, which is that way for cities to be more sustainable is to get denser and denser, right? And so what Bloomberg said was, there's no way we're giving that land back to Mother Nature. We're a great city. He did your line. We're going to build it back. We're going to come back stronger. And he said, let's put it on the, I keep coming back in and out here. Let's put it on the market, and let's make sure that the new developers, it's okay now, I think. Let's make sure the new developers build with the best, most modern material. Let's have first floors that can be flooded. And let's just rebuild, but better. And there the issue was, that means turning over the coastal areas to the wealthiest people. And so the residents who were going to move out and let their land turn into marshes and wetlands said, wait, we're not going to leave just so the richest people can come and take our homes. And it's brought in this really interesting political fight. So certainly we're going to build back differently. And a thing to follow and study if you're interested in doing research is what kinds of fights will we have over the way that we build and develop the coastline from now on, because the coasts are now turning into something different than they used to be. Thanks.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Eric, fantastic presentation. I love all the slides. Maybe just a comment and then ask questions. Singapore, we are a very small city, and we always worry that, if disaster struck, what happened. But our HDB flat actually was built, very interestingly, on steel. I don't know if you know, basically, if the water flood, I think our HDB flat actually are doing quite okay, because the first floor basically are also on steel, so there's nobody live there, and then all of them seems to be quite okay. It's the landed property which is a big problem now. Okay, so the prime property people are actually worried they have to buy insurance. Maybe you can share with us how a city like Singapore, a small city like Singapore, to be able to manage all this understanding with the disaster that you highlighted, whether it's heat wave. Actually, Singapore is quite warm actually. And
I noticed.
Yeah, whether it's heat, whether we don't have landslide, hopefully we don't have earthquake, but we got smog. Okay, we got haze. How do we manage all these things in terms of climate change? I mean, things are happening. We can't start to burn next door with our neighbor. So what are the things that we can do?
Well, I think it would be arrogant for me to tell you I can solve the problems. So I can't, so I can't say I figured it out. I mean, I think you would really, like the way to work on these things is to really understand the local conditions and to try to create forms of protection that will work here. I actually am very impressed by the Marina Barrage. I think I didn't just show that slide here because I wanted you to, think I admired you. I show that slide all over the world. And I wrote an article, for the New Yorker magazine about how cities could adapt to climate change, and I wrote, many paragraphs about Singapore because I think you're doing some really good work here. But you mentioned the fires and the smog. And earlier today, one of my hosts here was showing me images of what Singapore looked like a few months ago when I almost came. And that points to something else, which is a really interesting issue about the inequalities related to climate change. And that is that Singapore this is a very affluent society. This is a place that's going to be better able to protect itself than others. And I don't know that the fire and the smog from Indonesia this time was a climate change fire. Maybe there's something else going on. People slash and burn, and that creates its own issues. But we do know that with climate change will bring more droughts, and that more droughts will mean more forest fires that get out of control. And this has become a very big issue in the west of the United States. It's very dangerous. And what that means is that the quality of life and safety in Singapore is not just determined by what you do in Singapore. You can build incredible systems to keep the water out and make sure there's no flooding and a Marina Barrage and the ABCs and the XYZs and all those things. And then there's forest fires in Indonesia, and you suffer here. And there can be really major health consequences. Imagine that the forest fires are like that year after year. So this isn't the advice you were looking for, I know, but it does highlight for me the importance of regional cooperation and regional planning at a level that's not, just the UN meetings in Paris, but that it involves these kinds of issues. And one of the challenges, I think, for affluent societies everywhere is to figure out how to make reasonable investments in countries around them that have suffered, potentially as a consequence of the things that they have done. Singapore is small enough that its carbon impact is, it's so much lower than the American carbon impact that it's not fair to put it in the same world. But it's not nothing. It's not nothing. And let's face it, in order to get water, you have to start desalinating. And yesterday I got to tour the new water facility. So even you recycle there, and those are carbon-intensive processes. There's a lot of new building here, and those new buildings are going to consume more energy, and consumption is rising here. So Singapore is on the hook here as well. And I think these regional cooperation issues are very, very important. So in addition to the kind of urban infrastructure, that's someplace else I would look. Thank you for that good question.
I think we have only time for, since there are two hands, we will take both questions, but keep your questions short.
Maybe we'll take them back we'll take the questions back to back,
Okay.
And then
both
we'll
questions, then we'd like Prof. Eric to speak.
Okay. One suggestion, you go on Google DPM Taman's speech at Brooklyn Institute 2 days ago.
I'm sorry, I'm having trouble hearing you, sir.
Oh yeah. Our Deputy Prime Minister wanted to do DPM, just give a speech at the Brooklyn Institute in Washington, D.C. 2 days ago. And the simple gist of it is that, in a funny way, the whole of government approach to the creation, the planning, and design of our communities has proven that there's a way to develop healthy, resilient communities in Singapore that we've done compared to Paris, for example, or certain part of the US where you get ghettos. So that's one thing you might want to go on Google. It's a very good speech on resilient society.
Thank you.
Now, politicians sometimes do funny things. Since Rio de Janeiro, where the young daughter of David Suzuki verbalized that, up to now, the politicians are still fighting over what to do with climate change. But I think there seems to be a little light coming out of the private sector now in the US, because the US culture is very different from our culture. Right? Bill Gates is getting it together, his gang of 28, and they think they want to do something about it this time. Because they figure that if you leave it all to the politician, not much will be done by them. Okay, that's a new initiative that may come out of Paris this time. Okay, now, there's one story that you've been told here, which may be only half the story, which is the true flooding in Singapore. I live on Orchard Road. I experienced both of them. Now, one thing we have done very quickly, which a lot of people are not aware of, is that we roll our sleeve, we pull on a bootstrap on a hat, and we went to the ground, and we figured out what were the problems, and we addressed them, and they are more or less under control. Okay? A lot of you hear about the flash flood, but most of you don't hear about the remedy that we've done to it, so that if the flash flood that happened in 2011 happened again today, Orchard Road will be quite safe. All the property will be quite safe because all the measures are being in place already. Because within a rather quick time, because we have very good data of every building on Orchard Road, right? The threshold, where the flash point, and the ones that are vulnerable have been told to make sure you protect your weak points. All done already, double quick time. So that's something I think maybe other people can learn from us. Sometimes the whole government approach is very good. Maybe a bit blunt, but you get things done very quickly, effectively. And at the end of the day, you want to safeguard your people. You don't want to play politics, popular politics, you see. So I think in a funny way, our little place here, in a very experimental way, have done certain things which, after a while, has proven quite correctly. And Dr. Aileen was said earlier on, that's another point. We have done a lot of things in the social, cultural community, which is not very visible to most people, but you seem to have a good sense of it. The social capital we're building up quietly. And it's very different from the US situation, where it's from the ground up. For our case, it's actually top down from the government, whole government outward. But because we know that in this culture, if the government doesn't go and do it, it probably won't get done. Very different from the US culture.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Prof. Eric. My name is Suba. I'm a recent graduate in Sociology from Singapore Management University. I'm going to try to ask two quick questions related to the theme of building and harnessing the social fabric to react effectively to disasters relating to climate change, and especially through the empirical lens of flooding. So the first question is, when we talk about building communities, building interactions among people, building a social fabric, we talk about a local level. But sometimes when disasters happen, they don't affect all neighborhoods effectively, and the solutions might come from other neighborhoods. So for instance, if a part of the city is affected, you might need to get food supplies from another part, or to find housing for people from another part of the city. So to me, it seems that you need to also pay attention to building these translocal connections between communities. So how do you do that? That's the first question. And the second question, when we talk about flooding, now there's a recent example in the South Indian city of Chennai. There's been heavy rainfall, the highest in 100 years, and there's been a lot of flooding. So the first spate of the rainfall took part in the earlier part of November, and now there's the second part of it. And everything's affected. A large amount of the city is flooded, but in terms of mitigating the effect of the floods, what's worked has been people coming together over Facebook, like telling people there's a place here for people to stay, so tell people creating like open source maps to map out the places in the cities that are flooded. So, I mean, this is something that, people coming together, civic participation, using technological platforms to actually mitigate the effects of a disaster. So how can such platforms actually be harnessed better for future disasters?
Yeah, thanks. Those are terrific questions. And it's appropriate to end the conversation thinking about the future and new technologies we can use. So let me say, first of all, that on this first point about people in neighboring communities maybe needing to help people in other communities who are affected, that is exactly what happens during major flooding events, because typically, one neighborhood does okay, it's a little, up, and the other one's a little down, and it's affected. I showed an image before of these two community organizations. One was a surf club in the Rockaways, and the other was a youth employment organization in Red Hook in Brooklyn. And Red Hook is really a segregated area. It's gentrifying quite a lot now, but it's got one of the heaviest concentrations of public housing in New York City. This particular area is very heavily African American, and it's surrounded on the sides. There's a highway that's cut it off from the rest of the city. That's another example of really bad American planning. You know, we have these highways that cut off communities, but it's surrounded by all of these affluent communities that are much more white or Latino, Hispanic. And they don't have a lot of interaction on a regular basis. The whole city was planned so that they would not. It's like the opposite of Singapore. It's almost as if they said, how could we make sure that we have perfect segregation? Let's put a highway. First we'll build these public housing, and then we'll put a highway right between them and everybody else. That's basically what we did. So what do you think happened after Sandy? You know, did all the white and Hispanic people who are more affluent, you know, go out drinking and celebrating while everybody drowned in the Red Hook area? No, thousands of people came to Red Hook and participated in the volunteer effort. And this is kind of civic, you know, work at its best. And my view is that if you can see that in a very segregated and unequal American city today, that's a very good sign about the world, right? You're pretty likely to see that between two neighborhoods of citizens in Singapore. The question, and I don't know the answer, I mean, I haven't been here long enough, but the question is, if you have, you know, communities of guest workers in Singapore who are living in dormitories who don't participate in civic life here in the way that citizens do, are they sufficiently integrated into civic life that if they were suffering, if they were flooded out, that Singaporean citizens would go to offer help to them? Not just the government, which obviously would, but citizens themselves. What kind of civic participation? I don't know the answer to that. It might be that, of course, we would all go and we would all help. But I think those are the kinds of fault lines that I would examine here. And it's not just in Singapore. I think there's societies all over the world. Like at New York University, where I work, has just built a campus in Abu Dhabi. And when I say has just built a campus, what I mean is tens of thousands of guest laborers built a campus. And I don't know if they would get support if there was something catastrophic that happened here, or what kind of support. So I think for societies that are organized with a lot of guest laborers, that's a really interesting question, which I hand back to all of you. As for technology, it's amazing, you know, what you can do with Facebook and with sites like Ushahidi, which allow you to kind of do crisis mapping. You know, you can, if something happens in a neighborhood, you go on your phone and you register that there's a problem here, and then that information aggregates up. And so if there's an earthquake in Haiti, you look to see where the concentrated problems are, and you can direct resources in that way. And I have a slide, I didn't show it here, of an organization called Occupy Sandy, which did an enormous amount of work to provide services to suffering neighborhoods in New York City. And even the federal government, the FEMA, the big disaster relief operation, said what Occupy Sandy did was completely central to the relief effort and very important. So I think the technological resources we now have are great, with one caveat, actually two caveats. The first caveat is that not everyone knows how to use these devices similarly. And so let's say that we rely on social media and Ushahidi and crisis mapping to direct resources. But the people who are most vulnerable are older people who live alone, who aren't going to go on Ushahidi and aren't on Facebook. Then you do run the risk, if you direct resources that way, that the people who are already most vulnerable and isolated are going to get even more isolated, and that the people who are the most connected and media savvy are going to get the most attention. And that would be a bad outcome, right? We could agree on that. And the other thing I'll say is that the problem with all these digital social media is that if the infrastructure isn't strong enough to maintain service during a disaster, and as you remember, there was no phone service. I had no phone service during Sandy. Then the whole thing doesn't work. And then you're back to, smoke signals. And we've lost our smoke signaling skills as a species. We're just really bad at communicating by smoke signals these days. So for me, the lesson there is that we need to invest more in our communications infrastructure to make sure that it has the redundancies that older ones did. If we do that and we democratize access and make sure that older people know how to use these services as well, then we're not just making them safe for disasters, we're also helping them get connected and ensuring stronger social cohesion all the time. And that's what this is really all about. So thank you all for bearing with us for this long conversation. I've learned a lot, and I hope you have as well.
I think we all learned a lot from Prof. Eric Klinenberg, and I think we have. Let's give another warm round of applause for him.
Thank you very much, Professor Klinenberg and Ms. Chu, for sharing your insights and experiences with us. We would now like to invite Mr. Koo Teng Chai, Executive Director of Center for Liveable Cities, to present tokens of appreciation to our speaker and moderator, as well as for the photo taking. Mr. Koo, please. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, we have now come to the end of the lecture. We thank you for your participation. Do stay tuned to more CLC mailers and website for information on our upcoming events. We will also be seeking your feedback via email and would greatly appreciate if you could take some time to help us improve the lecture series. Have a good evening and we hope to see you again. Thank you.